The sealed tomb of Emperor Qin. The summer heat pressed down on the yellow earth of Shanxi province like a heavy blanket, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. In the fields outside the modern city of Xi'an, farmers had worked this land for generations, their ploughs cutting through soil that held secrets deeper than any living person could imagine. It was 1974, and the world was about to rediscover something that had been deliberately forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence. Young Jifa wiped the sweat from his brow and drove his shovel deeper into the ground. He and his brothers were digging a well, as their ancestors had done countless times before. The drought had been merciless that year, and the commune needed water desperately. The shovel struck something hard, and Yang assumed it was just another rock in this stubborn earth. But when he cleared away the dirt, he found himself staring at something that made his heart race, with a mixture of fear and wonder. A face made of terracotta, staring back at him from the darkness of 2,000 years. He didn't know it then, but Yang had stumbled upon the edge of the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. More importantly, he had found the key to understanding why Emperor Qin Shi Huang's actual tomb, the sealed mound that rose like a small mountain just over a kilometer away, had remained untouched, deliberately avoided, and carefully forgotten by generation after generation of Chinese people who knew exactly where it was, but refused to disturb it. The terracotta warriors that Yang and his brothers discovered that day were not the tomb itself. They were guardians, an army of 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, and 670 horses, all rendered in clay with such precision that each face was unique, each expression different. These warriors stood in battle formation in massive underground pits, facing east toward the lands Qin Shi Huang had conquered, eternally vigilant against enemies who might threaten their emperor even in death. But the warriors were merely the outermost ring of protection. The actual tomb of Emperor Qin, the first emperor who had unified China in 221 BC, lay untouched beneath a massive earthen pyramid that locals had always called Mount Li. For more than 2 millennia, this artificial mountain had dominated the landscape, and yet the tomb beneath it remained sealed, its secrets intact, its interior preserved exactly as it had been when the emperor was laid to rest in 210 BC. The question that haunted archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters alike was simple yet profound. Why had such an obviously important site never been looted? Why had grave robbers, who'd violated virtually every other imperial tomb in Chinese history, left this one alone? And why did the Chinese government, even after discovering the terracotta warriors, refuse to excavate the tomb itself? The answer lay buried not just in earth, but in history, legend, and fear. To understand the tomb, one must first understand the man who built it. Yingzheng became king of Qin at the age of 13 in 246 BC, inheriting a kingdom that was already powerful, but still just one among 7 warring states that had torn China apart for centuries. The boy king was intelligent, ruthless, and possessed by a vision that would have seemed impossible to anyone else. He would unite all of China under his rule, ending the centuries of warfare and creating a single unified empire. It took him 25 years, but Yingzheng accomplished what no one before him had managed. Through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and sheer force of will, he defeated the other 6 kingdoms one by one. In 221 BC, at the age of 38, he declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, and China as a unified nation was born. But unification was just the beginning of his ambitions. Qin Shi Huang standardized everything he could touch: the writing system, currency, weights and measures, even the width of cart axles, so that all vehicles would fit in the same road ruts. He connected and extended various defensive walls to create what would eventually become the Great Wall of China, stretching thousands of kilometers across the northern frontier. He built a network of roads and canals that would facilitate trade and military movement for centuries to come. Yet for all his accomplishments in life, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with death. More specifically, he was obsessed with avoiding it. The emperor surrounded himself with alchemists and magicians who promised to discover the elixir of immortality. He sent expeditions across the seas to find the mythical islands of the immortals. He consumed mercury pills that his advisors swore would extend his life, never realizing that the mercury was actually poisoning him, slowly killing him, even as he desperately sought to live forever. When it became clear that physical immortality might elude him, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention to ensuring that his power and status would continue into the afterlife. He began construction of his tomb when he first became king of Qin at age 13, and the project continued throughout his entire reign, a period of 36 years in total. At its peak, 700,000 workers labored on the tomb complex, which covered nearly 60 square kilometers. The tomb was designed to be more than a burial place. According to the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after Qin's death, the tomb was a recreation of the emperor's realm in miniature. The ceiling was decorated with pearls representing the stars and constellations. The floor contained a detailed map of the empire, with rivers of mercury flowing through channels, representing the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, mechanically circulated to simulate their actual flow. The entire chamber was designed to be a universe unto itself, with the emperor at its center, ruling for eternity as he had ruled in life. But Sima Qian's account also included details that would make the tomb one of the most dangerous places on Earth to enter. The historian wrote that the tomb was filled with traps, automatic crossbows set to fire at anyone who entered, designed to protect the emperor's rest for all time. He described how the workers who knew the tomb's secrets and the location of the treasures were sealed inside when the tomb was closed, ensuring their silence forever. He mentioned that the entrance passages were filled with stone and concealed, making the tomb virtually impossible to locate or enter. Most ominously, Sima Qian wrote about the rivers of mercury that filled the tomb chamber. At the time, many scholars dismissed this as poetic exaggeration or myth. Mercury was valuable in ancient China, used in various rituals and medicines, but the idea that enough mercury existed to create actual rivers seemed impossible. The tomb would need to contain more than 100 tons of mercury for Sima Qian's description to be literally true. Then, in the late 20th century, scientists conducting soil tests around the burial mound made a startling discovery. Mercury concentrations in the soil directly above the tomb were exponentially higher than in surrounding areas, not just slightly elevated, but astronomically high. The distribution pattern of the mercury matched the descriptions of rivers in Sima Qian's account, suggesting that vast quantities of liquid mercury did indeed exist somewhere beneath the mound, and that vapor was still seeping up through the earth after more than 2,000 years. This discovery transformed the tomb from a historical curiosity into a genuine hazard. Mercury vapor is highly toxic, capable of causing severe neurological damage, respiratory failure, and death. If the tomb were opened and the mercury was still present in liquid form, the release of concentrated mercury vapor could be catastrophic, not just for the excavation team, but potentially for the surrounding area. But the mercury wasn't the only reason the tomb remained sealed. There was something else, something that couldn't be measured by scientific instruments or explained by rational analysis. There was fear. The local people had always known about the tomb. Farmers had ploughed fields around its base for generations. During various periods of unrest and rebellion, when imperial tombs across China were being systematically looted, the tomb of the first emperor remained untouched. Even during the Cultural Revolution, when Red Guards were destroying historical sites across China, vandalizing temples and desecrating graves in their fervour to erase the past, they left the tomb of Emperor Qin alone. When archaeologists began interviewing elderly residents of the area after the discovery of the terracotta warriors, they heard the same stories repeated across different families and villages. The tomb was cursed. Anyone who disturbed it would die. Not in some distant, abstract way, but quickly, violently, and with certainty. These weren't vague superstitions passed down through countless generations until their origins were forgotten. These were specific warnings, carefully maintained and deliberately taught to each new generation. Old men spoke of their grandfathers, warning them never to dig too deeply near the mound, never to explore the caves and depressions that occasionally appeared around its base, never to take even a small artifact if one should appear on the surface after a heavy rain or erosion. There were stories, too, cautionary tales about those who had ignored the warnings. A treasure hunter during the Ming Dynasty, some 400 years after the tomb was sealed, who had tried to tunnel into the mound. He and his entire crew were found dead at the tunnel entrance, their bodies showing no signs of violence, but their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. A group of soldiers during the warlord period of the 1920s who had attempted to blast their way into the tomb using dynamite, seeking treasure to fund their army. The explosion never happened. Instead, all 16 men were found unconscious near the mound, and every one of them died within 3 days, raving about guardian spirits and ancient curses before finally succumbing. More recently, there were quieter stories, whispered among the archaeological community. Team members who had worked on excavating the terracotta warrior pits, safely distant from the tomb itself, but who had ventured too close to the main mound out of curiosity. 3 researchers over the years had died in unusual accidents shortly after such visits. A car crash that investigators could never adequately explain. A sudden heart attack in a man with no history of heart disease. A fall from a height that should not have been fatal, but somehow was. Coincidence, certainly. Statistically inevitable when thousands of people worked on and around the site over decades. And yet the stories persisted, and even hardened scientists found themselves reluctant to press too hard for excavation of the main tomb. The Chinese government maintained that the tomb remained sealed for practical reasons. The technology to safely excavate and preserve the tomb's contents did not yet exist. The mercury contamination posed genuine risks. Opening the tomb prematurely could destroy priceless artifacts through exposure to air and light, just as had happened with other archaeological sites, that were excavated before preservation techniques were adequately developed. Better to wait, to plan, to develop the proper methods than to rush in and destroy irreplaceable evidence of China's history. All of this was true. All of it was rational, sensible, scientifically sound, and yet those who looked closely could see that there was something else, something unspoken in the government's repeated decisions to postpone excavation indefinitely, despite the availability of funding, despite international interest, despite the potential for discoveries that could revolutionize understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. The archaeologists who dedicated their careers to studying the tomb complex understood the official reasons, but they also understood something else. They had felt it themselves when they stood before the sealed mound, looking up at the artificial mountain that contained the first emperor. There was a presence there, something that defied rational explanation, but was no less real for its inexplicability. Dr. Wei Lin had been one of the first archaeologists to study the terracotta warriors after their discovery. She had spent 40 years of her life working on the site, had supervised the excavation of 3 of the warrior pits, had published dozens of papers on what they revealed about Qin military organization, artistic techniques, and technological capabilities. She had been interviewed hundreds of times by journalists, documentary makers, and academics from around the world, and every single time they asked her the same question: when will you excavate the tomb itself? Now 82 years old, Dr. Wei sat in her small apartment in Xi'an, surrounded by books and artifacts, photographs and memories. She had finally agreed to speak honestly about why the tomb remained sealed, though she knew many would dismiss her words as the rambling of an old woman whose scientific rigor had been eroded by age and superstition. I went into the first warrior pit when I was 38 years old, she began, her voice still strong despite her years. I was young, ambitious, completely devoted to scientific archaeology. I thought the stories about curses and guardian spirits were folklore, nothing more. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, but not something to be taken seriously by trained scientists. She paused, looking at the window toward where the tomb mound rose in the distance, visible even from her apartment several kilometers away. The first time I approached the actual tomb, not the warrior pits, but the central mound itself, I was 41. It was 1983, and we were conducting a survey, taking measurements, planning potential excavation strategies. We never intended to dig that day, just to study the exterior, to understand the structure better. I climbed about halfway up the mound with 2 colleagues. It was early morning, the sun just rising, the air cool and clear, and as we climbed, I began to feel something. Not fear exactly, but a sense of being watched, of being evaluated, of being judged as to whether we were worthy to proceed. I told myself it was just the psychological weight of standing on top of such an important historical site, the knowledge of what lay beneath our feet. But then my colleague Dr. Zhang, a man who had never shown the slightest interest in anything supernatural, who mocked fortune tellers and refused to observe traditional customs, he stopped climbing. Just stopped mid-step and stood completely still. After perhaps 30 seconds, he turned around and walked back down without saying a word. When we caught up with him at the base of the mound, he said he wouldn't climb it again. He never did. He continued working on the warrior pits for another 20 years, but he never set foot on the main mound again, and he never explained why. Dr. Wei's story was not unique. Over the decades, numerous researchers had reported similar experiences. A sense of overwhelming dread when approaching the tomb, dreams of ancient armies and underground palaces, feelings of being actively discouraged from proceeding. Some dismissed these accounts as suggestion and psychology. People had heard the legends, so they interpreted normal nervousness as something supernatural. But the consistency of the reports, especially from scientists who had no previous belief in such phenomena, suggested something more. Perhaps the explanation was simpler than curses or guardian spirits. Perhaps Qin Shi Huang, in his obsessive quest for eternal power, had built something genuinely dangerous. The mercury was real, proven by scientific testing. If the tomb was opened and the seals were broken, mercury vapor could flood out in concentrations that would be lethal. The automatic crossbows described by Sima Qian might still be functional. Similar mechanisms from the Qin period had been found in other sites, their bronze components still operational after thousands of years in the right conditions. The tomb might be structurally unstable, supported by wooden beams that had degraded over millennia, ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. Or perhaps there was something else inside, something that the first emperor had left behind intentionally. Qin Shi Huang had been desperate for immortality, had surrounded himself with mystics and alchemists, had believed deeply in forces that transcended the physical world. What if, in his final preparations, he had done something to ensure that his rest would never be disturbed? Not merely physical traps, but something else. Some ritual or curse or working of forces that the modern world had dismissed, but which the ancient world had understood. The archaeological evidence suggested that something extraordinary had happened when the tomb was finally sealed. Historical records indicated that the second emperor, Qin Shi Huang's son, who succeeded him, had ordered the tomb sealed and the access passages filled in immediately after the first emperor's death in 210 BC. The records also stated that all the craftsmen and workers who had knowledge of the tomb's interior layout were killed or sealed inside to maintain secrecy. But there was another detail, mentioned only in a few fragmentary sources, that most scholars overlooked. The records indicated that several of the alchemists and mystics who had served the first emperor volunteered to be sealed inside the tomb with him. Not as human sacrifices, those were common enough in ancient China, but as willing participants in some working or ritual that required their presence. What were they doing in there? What final service were they performing for their emperor? The tomb remained sealed, and with each passing year, the reasons to leave it that way seemed to multiply. The technology to safely excavate it would always be not quite ready. The potential risks would always outweigh the potential benefits. The ethical questions would always remain unresolved. Did anyone have the right to disturb a burial site so deliberately and carefully prepared, regardless of its historical significance? And beneath all the rational justifications, there remained that unspoken awareness, that sense that some places were meant to remain undisturbed, that some secrets were meant to stay buried, and that the first emperor of China, in his obsessive preparations for death and his desperate quest for eternal power, had succeeded in creating something that would outlast not just his dynasty, not just his civilization, but potentially any civilization that might come after. The terracotta warriors stood in their pits, facing east, eternally vigilant. Tourists walked among them now, marveling at their craftsmanship, taking photographs, purchasing souvenirs. But beyond the warriors, past the outer rings of defense, the tomb itself remained as it had been for more than 2,000 years, sealed, silent, and utterly impenetrable. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the tourists had gone and the site was still, the guards reported hearing sounds from the direction of the tomb. Not loud sounds, nothing dramatic or frightening, just a low humming, like machinery running deep underground, like the circulation of the ancient rivers, like the breathing of something vast and patient that was willing to wait as long as necessary. The guards would listen for a moment, then return to their rounds, and the sound would fade back into the silence of centuries. The first emperor rested in his sealed tomb, surrounded by his rivers of mercury and his guardian spirits, protected by his traps and his curses, secure in the darkness of his underground palace, waiting for an eternity that might already be passing, ruling over a realm of death with the same absolute authority he had once commanded over the living. And above him, the world turned and changed and forgot, until all that remained was the mound and the warriors, and the unshakable certainty that some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. The Knights Templar's hidden treasure. The autumn rain hammered against the limestone walls of the Templar commandery in Poitou, France, as Brother Guillaume pressed his weathered hands against the cold stone table. Before him lay a rolled parchment sealed with wax, bearing the unmistakable cross pâté of the order. The year was 1307, and whispers of King Philip's intentions had reached even this remote outpost. "They will come for us," said Brother Arnaud, his younger companion, voice trembling slightly. "The king's men are already moving through Paris. They arrested Grand Master de Molay at dawn 3 days ago." Guillaume nodded slowly, his grey beard catching the firelight from the hearth. He had served the order for 43 years, since he was barely 14, and had witnessed the fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. He had carried secrets across the Mediterranean, guarded treasures in the vaults beneath the Paris temple. Now, in the twilight of his service, he faced the greatest task of all. "Then we have less time than I hoped," Guillaume said, breaking the seal on the parchment. His eyes scanned the Latin script, written in the distinctive hand of the order's treasurer. "The instructions are clear. We are to move the contents of the vault to the designated location. The maps have been divided among 7 commanderies, and we hold the 3rd key." The treasure of the Knights Templar was not simply gold and silver, though there was plenty of that. Over 2 centuries, the warrior monks had accumulated wealth that rivaled kingdoms. They had established the first international banking system, holding deposits for nobles, merchants, and even rival monarchs. Their fleet controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. But the true treasure, the one that made kings tremble and popes uneasy, was knowledge, documents, relics, and secrets gathered from the ancient world. Guillaume rose from the table and moved to the eastern wall of the chamber. He counted 7 stones from the corner and pressed against a particular block. With a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Arnaud lit a torch, and together they descended into the depths beneath the commandery. The vault was not large, but what it contained was priceless. Wooden chests bound with iron bands lined the walls. Guillaume knew their contents intimately. Each had been catalogued and committed to memory. There were Byzantine manuscripts rescued from Constantinople, scrolls recovered from the libraries of Alexandria through intermediaries in Cairo, astronomical charts from Muslim scholars, and documents that challenged the very foundations of the Church's teachings. In the centre of the vault stood a stone altar, and upon it rested an object wrapped in crimson silk. Guillaume approached it reverently, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of what he touched. He unwrapped the silk carefully, revealing a copper scroll covered in ancient Hebrew script. "Is that—" Arnaud began, his voice barely a whisper. "The copper scroll from Qumran," Guillaume confirmed, "one of the Dead Sea texts. Describes the locations of treasures hidden before the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Order acquired it 30 years ago through contacts in the East. Some say it is merely symbolic, but I have studied it. The measurements are too precise, the locations too specific. It is genuine." But there was more. Behind the altar, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that Guillaume had been sworn to protect above all else. He carefully removed the covering, revealing a wooden box of acacia wood, its surface covered with gold leaf and intricate carvings. Craftsmanship was unmistakably ancient, predating even Rome itself. "What is it?" Arnaud asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Guillaume hesitated. The younger knight had taken his vows, had proven himself in battle, but some secrets were almost too dangerous to share. Yet, if Guillaume fell, if King Philip's men captured or killed him, someone else needed to know. "There are legends," Guillaume began, "of what the first Templars found beneath Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Most believe we discovered gold, perhaps the treasures of Herod, but the 9 knights who established our order spent 9 years excavating beneath the Temple Mount. What would take 9 years to find?" He opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled in aged linen, were fragments of stone tablets, the Hebrew letters still visible despite their great age. Beside them lay several papyrus scrolls, their edges crumbling, but their contents preserved by the dry climate of their original resting place. "These tablets," Guillaume said, his voice heavy with significance, "are said to be fragments of the original stones carried down from Mount Sinai. The scrolls contain teachings that were never included in the approved scripture, texts that show a very different understanding of the divine than what Rome permits." Arnaud's face paled. "If the Church knew—" "They do know, or at least suspect," Guillaume replied. "Why else would King Philip move against us so suddenly? The Order has become too powerful, too independent. We answer to no king, only to the Pope, and even Rome fears what we might reveal. Philip needs our wealth to pay his debts, but he also needs to ensure these secrets never surface." For 3 nights, the 2 knights worked tirelessly. They removed the contents of the vault, carefully packing everything into leather satchels and wooden crates designed to be carried by horse. The gold and silver were separated. Some would be buried in locations marked on the fractured map, insurance for the Order's future. But the documents, the scrolls, the tablets, these would be moved together to a single location where they could be protected. On the 4th morning, a messenger arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Guillaume recognized him as Brother Michel from the Tours Commandery. "They are coming," Michel gasped, accepting a cup of water. "The King's Seneschal rides with 300 men. They have orders to arrest every Templar in France and seize all property I rode through the night to warn you." Guillaume glanced at Arnaud. "How much time?" "A day, perhaps less. They were making camp at Loudun when I passed them." It would have to be enough. Guillaume had already arranged for a ship, a Templar vessel that had been loading cargo in La Rochelle for the past week, ostensibly bound for Scotland with wool and wine. The captain was a man Guillaume trusted, someone who owed the order his life and would ask no questions. They loaded the horses under cover of darkness. 12 animals in total, 8 carrying the treasure, 4 for the riders. Guillaume, Arnaud, Michel, and a 4th knight, Brother Thomas, who served as the commandery's military commander. Each man wore plain clothing, their Templar mantles hidden in their saddlebags. They could not risk being identified on the road. The journey to La Rochelle normally took 3 days, but Guillaume pushed them hard, staying off the main roads, cutting through forests and following old Roman paths that few remembered. They paused only briefly to rest the horses and snatch a few hours of sleep in abandoned shepherds' huts or beneath the shelter of ancient oaks. On the 2nd day, as they forded a stream in the Vendée, Arnaud spotted riders in the distance. 5 men, wearing the king's colours, moving parallel to their position. Guillaume made a quick decision. They couldn't risk a confrontation. Even if they prevailed, the alarm would be raised. "There's a forest ahead," Thomas said, studying the landscape. "Thick growth, difficult for horses. We could lose them there." They urged their mounts forward, the pack animals protesting the increased pace. Behind them, the royal men-at-arms had spotted them and gave chase. Guillaume felt his heart pounding, not from fear for himself, but from the terror that 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge might fall into the wrong hands. The forest was dense with oak and beech, the undergrowth thick with brambles. They plunged into it, the branches clawing at their clothing. Behind them came shouts, the sound of horses crashing through brush. Guillaume led them deeper, following a path that Thomas had used years before when hunting in these woods. They emerged into a clearing, and for a moment, Guillaume thought they were trapped, but Thomas pointed to a narrow ravine, barely visible behind a screen of ferns. "This way." The ravine was steep, the descent treacherous, but the pack horses were mountain-bred and sure-footed. They picked their way down carefully, while behind them the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The king's men, unfamiliar with the terrain, had lost them in the dense forest. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of La Rochelle. The port city was bustling even at this late hour, ships being loaded by torchlight, merchants arguing over cargo manifests, sailors singing in taverns near the docks. Guillaume led them to a warehouse near the harbour, identified by a small carved cross above the door, a Templar safe house. The warehouse keeper, an old sailor named Pierre, who had lost his leg in service to the order, opened the door quickly and ushered them inside. "The ship awaits, Brother Guillaume. Captain Jean has been asking for you. The tide turns at dawn, and he wishes to depart immediately." They worked through the night, transferring the cargo from horses to ship. The vessel was a sturdy cog, broad-beamed and built for Atlantic waters, with a single mast and a crew of 20. Captain Jean was a Breton, his face weathered by years at sea, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Scotland?" Guillaume asked, as the last of the crates were loaded into the hold. "Eventually," Jean replied. "But we'll stop first at several ports along the way. If we're being followed, I want to lay false trails. We'll put in at Bordeaux, claim we're heading to England." Then we'll sail north to Brittany, spread word that we're trading with Ireland. By the time anyone figures out our true destination, we'll be long gone." Guillaume approved. The captain was thinking ahead, protecting not just this voyage, but future operations. The order had been betrayed, but it was not destroyed, not yet. As dawn broke over La Rochelle, the ship slipped its moorings and moved out into the harbour. Guillaume stood at the rail, watching the city recede into the morning mist. Somewhere behind them, King Philip's men were ransacking Templar properties, arresting knights, seizing assets. But the true treasure of the order was safely aboard this vessel, sailing toward a new home. The voyage was not easy. They encountered storms off the Breton coast that tested even Captain Jean's considerable skill. The Atlantic in October was unforgiving, with waves that towered over the ship's rail and winds that threatened to tear the sail from its rigging. Guillaume spent much of the journey below decks, securing the cargo, ensuring that nothing was damaged by the constant pitching and rolling. Brother Arnaud proved to have a weak stomach for sea travel and spent 3 days barely able to lift his head. Michel fared better, helping the crew with their work, his muscular frame useful in managing the heavy canvas and thick ropes. Thomas stood watch, his soldier's instincts keeping him alert for any sign of pursuit, though on the empty ocean there was little threat beyond the elements themselves. After 10 days at sea, they reached the Scottish coast. Captain Jean guided the ship through treacherous waters, past rocky outcrops and hidden reefs, following a passage that only local pilots knew. They anchored in a secluded bay on the western coast, where steep cliffs provided natural protection and dense forests came almost to the water's edge. Guillaume had chosen this location carefully, years before, when it became clear that the Order's position in France was becoming precarious. Scotland was beyond the reach of Philip's power, and King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope and locked in a struggle for his throne, had no love for the church hierarchy that condemned him. He would welcome Templar gold and Templar knights, and in return he would offer protection. But Guillaume's destination was not a castle or a city. Deep in the Scottish Highlands, in a valley accessible only by a single narrow pass, stood the ruins of an ancient monastery. It had been built centuries ago by Irish monks, long before the Norse raids, and had been abandoned for 200 years. The locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted, which suited Guillaume's purposes perfectly. They transferred the cargo to pack horses again, animals purchased from a local laird who asked no questions when presented with good silver. The journey inland took another week, following paths that were barely more than game trails, climbing into mountains where mist clung to the peaks, and rain fell almost constantly. The valley, when they finally reached it, was exactly as Guillaume remembered from his single previous visit, 20 years earlier. A narrow gorge opened into a sheltered basin, surrounded on all sides by steep slopes. A stream ran through the center, feeding a small lake. The ruins of the monastery stood on a slight rise above the water, its stone walls still largely intact despite centuries of neglect. "This is where we hide the treasure of the Order?" Arnaud asked, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice. He had perhaps expected something more dramatic, more befitting the legends. Guillaume smiled. "This is where we preserve it, yes, but not in the ruins themselves. Come." He led them past the crumbling monastery to the base of the cliff that formed the valley's northern wall. Water seeped from the rock face, creating a perpetually wet surface covered in moss and ferns. Guillaume pushed aside the vegetation, revealing the opening of a cave. "Natural?" Thomas asked, studying the entrance with a military eye. "In part," Guillaume replied, "but expanded long ago. The Irish monks used it as a crypt. There are chambers inside, carved from the living rock, dry, cool, perfect for preserving documents." They spent the next month preparing the cave system. Using tools they had brought with them, they carved deeper chambers, created ventilation shafts disguised as natural fissures, and built hidden doorways that could be sealed from within. The gold and silver were divided, some buried in scattered locations throughout the valley, others placed in chambers within the cave, sealed behind false walls that appeared to be solid rock. The documents, scrolls, and relics were given the greatest care. Guillaume constructed wooden shelves, treated with oils to resist moisture. Each scroll was wrapped individually in oiled leather, each document placed between boards of cedar wood. The stone tablets were set into recesses carved specifically for them, protected by multiple layers of sealing. As winter approached and the first snows began to fall in the highlands, Guillaume knew their work was nearly complete. He gathered the 3 knights in the main chamber of the cave, where a small fire provided light and warmth. "What we have preserved here must remain hidden until the time is right for it to be revealed," he said, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "The order may be scattered, our brothers imprisoned or worse, but our legacy endures. The knowledge we have gathered, the truths we have discovered, they are more valuable than all the gold in Christendom." He produced a leather journal from his pack, its pages covered in his own careful handwriting. "I have created this guide for those who come after us. It contains the key to understanding what we have hidden. Here, descriptions of the most important documents, and instructions for interpreting the copper scroll. But the journal itself is encrypted, using a cipher known only to senior members of the Order. And if the Order is destroyed," Mitchell asked quietly, "if there is no one left who knows the cipher?" Guillaume had considered this possibility. "Then we must ensure the knowledge survives in other ways. Thomas, you will return to France carefully in disguise. Find any surviving brothers and pass word of this location. Use the old signs, the marks that only we understand. Arno, you will go to Portugal, where some of our number have found refuge under a different name. Tell them what we have accomplished here. Michelle, you will remain in Scotland, establish yourself, perhaps marry, have children. Pass down the knowledge in your family, coded in stories and songs, so that even if the Order fades from memory, there will be those who remember." "And you, Brother Guillaume?" Arnaud asked. "I am old," Guillaume said simply. "My task is complete. I will remain here, in this valley, as guardian. When spring comes, you will build me a small dwelling near the cave entrance. I will live out my remaining years, ensuring that what we have hidden remains secure." The 3 younger knights tried to protest, but Guillaume raised his hand. "This is not punishment, but privilege. I have spent my life in service to the Order, and I can think of no better way to end it than as the keeper of our greatest treasure. Besides, someone must remain. If the entrance is left unguarded, if shepherds or hunters stumble upon it, everything we have risked will be for nothing." Through that first winter, Guillaume lived in a simple stone hut the knights constructed for him, before departing on their separate missions. The structure was built against the base of the cliff, using stones from the ruined monastery, with a roof of slate and timber. A small hearth provided warmth, and the stream offered fresh water and fish. Guillaume had provisions enough to last until spring, when he could plant a small garden. The solitude did not trouble him. After decades of communal living in Templar commanderies, where silence was often enforced but privacy rare, he found the isolation almost restful. His days fell into a rhythm: morning prayers, maintenance of the cave and its contents, foraging for food, and in the evenings, by firelight, he worked on his journal, adding details, refining the cipher, ensuring that his knowledge would not die with him. Spring came late to the highlands, but when it arrived, the valley transformed. Wildflowers covered the meadows, birds returned to nest in the cliffs, and the stream swelled with snowmelt. Guillaume planted barley and turnips, tended a small flock of sheep he had traded for with the nearest settlement, and gradually transformed his temporary shelter into a permanent hermitage. Months passed into years. Guillaume aged, his beard turning completely white, his movements slower but still purposeful. He marked the passage of time by carving notches into a wooden staff, one for each month. He prayed for his brothers in the order, wondering how many had survived the king's persecution. He knew that Grand Master Jacques de Molay had been burned at the stake in Paris, and that hundreds of other Templars had been tortured, imprisoned, or killed. But he also knew that many had escaped, had found refuge in places beyond Philip's reach. In the 3rd year of his guardianship, a visitor arrived. Guillaume was working in his garden when he heard a horse approaching. His hand went instinctively to the sword he still kept close, though he was now 70 years old and doubted he could put up much of a fight. But when the rider emerged from the narrow pass, Guillaume recognized the travel-worn face of Brother Michel. "You've returned," Guillaume said, embracing his former companion. "I bring news," Michel replied. "Much has happened in the world beyond this valley. The order has been officially dissolved by papal decree, our properties distributed to the Hospitallers, our name condemned. But there are survivors, scattered groups who maintain the traditions in secret. Some have joined other orders, some have simply disappeared into ordinary life, but they remember. They sat by Guillaume's fire that night, while Michel shared his news. He had indeed established himself in Scotland, married a local woman, and now had 2 young sons. He worked as a merchant, his Templar past carefully hidden, but he maintained contact with others who had escaped the purge. There was an underground network, he explained, of former Templars and their descendants, passing messages through coded letters and secret symbols. "There's more," Michel said, his voice dropping. "There's a legend spreading, particularly in France. People say that the Templar treasure was never found, that it was smuggled away before the arrests. Some claim it was taken to Scotland, others say Portugal or Cyprus. There are treasure hunters, adventurers, and agents of various kings searching for it." Guillaume nodded slowly. He had anticipated this. "Have any come close?" "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. That's why I've come. We need to add additional protections, create false trails, ensure that if someone does find this valley, they won't easily discover what lies beneath." Over the following weeks, they worked together to enhance the cave's concealment. They created a false chamber near the entrance, placing some items of moderate value, old coins, a few pieces of silver plate, some unremarkable documents. Where they could be found? Any treasure hunter discovering this decoy would believe they had found the Templar cache and might not search further. The true treasure, deeper in the cave system, was hidden behind sealed passages that appeared to be natural walls. They also created markers, symbols that would mean nothing to outsiders, but would guide initiated members of the Order to the valley. Guillaume knew that as time passed and he eventually died, there needed to be a way for others to find what had been hidden. So they carved subtle signs into rocks along the approach route. A cross here, a geometric pattern there, markers that would endure for centuries if properly maintained. Michel stayed for 3 months before departing again, promising to return when he could. Guillaume resumed his solitary existence, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just guarding the treasure, but maintaining a beacon for the future, a light that would guide those who came seeking truth. More years passed. Guillaume's body grew weaker, but his mind remained sharp. He transferred more of his knowledge into his journal, knowing that his time was limited. He wrote about the significance of each major document in the collection, explained the context of the relics, and provided his own translations and interpretations of the most important texts. One document in particular had occupied much of his later research. A gospel, not one of the 4 approved by the Church, but an account attributed to Mary Magdalene herself. The order had acquired it from a monastery in Ethiopia, where such alternative scriptures had been preserved by their isolated Christian community. Guillaume had spent years studying it, comparing it with other texts in the collection, and he was convinced of its authenticity. The Gospel presented a very different picture of Christ's mission, emphasizing spiritual knowledge over blind faith, suggesting that salvation came through understanding rather than through the institutional church. It was easy to see why such texts had been suppressed. They challenged the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. But Guillaume believed that truth, however uncomfortable, deserved to be preserved. In the year 1320, 13 years after he had first entered the valley, Guillaume knew his end was approaching. His heart troubled him, his breathing was laboured, and he could no longer work in the garden or tend the sheep. He spent his final days in the cave itself, among the treasures he had protected for so long. His journal opened before him as he added his final entries. He wrote instructions for whoever would find his body and his journal. He explained how to access the sealed chambers, how to interpret the cipher he had used, and most importantly, he wrote why these things mattered. Knowledge, he insisted, was humanity's greatest treasure, more valuable than gold because it could not be stolen, could not corrode, could only grow and compound over generations. On a cold morning in late autumn, Guillaume died peacefully in the cave, his hand resting on the wooden box containing the stone tablets, his journal beside him. His body was discovered weeks later by a shepherd who had ventured into the valley seeking lost sheep. The man, frightened by finding a corpse in what locals considered a haunted place, quickly retreated and told no one except the village priest. The priest, a former Templar sergeant named Edmund, who had escaped persecution by taking holy orders under a false name, recognized the description of the dead man and understood immediately what it meant. He traveled to the valley, found Guillaume's body, and gave him a proper burial in the small cemetery beside the ruined monastery. And then, understanding his duty, Edmund took Guillaume's journal and added his own name to the list of guardians. For the next 2 centuries, the valley remained protected by a succession of such guardians, each one a descendant or associate of the Templar network that had survived underground. They lived as hermits, shepherds, or monks, maintaining the valley's isolation while ensuring the cave and its contents remained undisturbed. The journal passed from hand to hand, each guardian adding their own entries, recording historical events, noting changes to the hiding places, and preserving the knowledge of the cipher. By the early 16th century, during the upheaval of the Reformation, the guardianship had passed to a family of Scottish Protestants who saw the preserved documents as ammunition against Catholic Rome. They understood that the alternative Gospels and ancient texts could support their arguments for a return to a purer, earlier Christianity. But they also recognized the danger. Revealing the treasure too soon, before the time was right, might lead to its destruction rather than its vindication. The guardian in 1547 was a woman named Isabel MacLeod, granddaughter of the previous keeper, who had learned the secrets of the valley from her father after her older brothers died in clan warfare. She was unusual for her time, literate, educated in Latin and Greek, and fiercely protective of her charge. She copied portions of the hidden documents, making translations that she could share with trusted scholars without revealing the existence of the original texts. One of these scholars was a young mathematician and astronomer named John Napier, who would later become famous for inventing logarithms. Isabel showed him astronomical texts from the Templar collection, calculations made by Persian and Arab scholars that were far in advance of European knowledge. These texts influenced Napier's own work, though he never knew their true source. Isabel made another crucial contribution to the treasure's preservation. She created a comprehensive map of the valley and cave system, showing not just the location of the hidden chambers, but also the meanings of the various symbols and markers. She appended this map to Guillaume's journal, which had grown considerably over the centuries, and she instituted a practice that would continue for generations. Each guardian would create a copy of the most essential information and hide it in a separate location, insurance against the loss of the main journal. The 17th century brought new dangers. The English Civil War spilled into Scotland, armies marched across the Highlands, and refugees fled into remote areas seeking safety. Twice the valley was nearly discovered by soldiers, and once by a group of Covenanters fleeing persecution. Each time, the Guardian managed to convince the intruders that the valley was cursed or haunted, encouraging them to move on quickly. By 1700, the direct line of Templar descendants had thinned considerably. Many had died without heirs, others had emigrated to the New World, and some had simply lost interest in maintaining the ancient trust. The guardianship passed to a Catholic family, the Frasers, who had their own reasons for protecting secrets from Protestant authorities. They understood that the documents in the cave could be dangerous to both Catholic and Protestant establishments, proving that both sides had distorted early Christian teachings to suit their own purposes. Throughout the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought new interest in ancient texts and historical mysteries. Scholars began to seriously study comparative religion, to question traditional narratives, and to seek out alternative sources. The guardians of the valley began to wonder if perhaps the time had finally come to reveal at least some of what had been hidden. In 1776, a young scholar named William Fraser, current guardian, made contact with Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria. Weishaupt had founded an organization dedicated to preserving and propagating Enlightenment ideals against religious obscurantism. William provided him with copies of some of the philosophical texts from the collection, though not the most sensitive materials. This connection would later give rise to conspiracy theories linking the Templars, the Illuminati, and various other secret societies, most of which were based on misunderstandings and exaggerations. The French Revolution nearly proved disastrous for the treasure. Revolutionary fervour against the church and aristocracy included hatred of the Templars, who were seen as symbols of medieval corruption. Treasure hunters, newly emboldened, began searching more aggressively for Templar caches throughout Europe. Several expeditions came to Scotland following rumours and legends, though none found the hidden valley. As the 19th century progressed, the guardianship faced a new challenge: modernisation. Railways were being built across Scotland, remote areas were being mapped and surveyed, and the valley's isolation could not be guaranteed forever. In 1842, the Guardian, a schoolteacher named Robert Cameron, made a momentous decision. He began to slowly, carefully, move some of the most important documents to other locations. This was controversial even among the small network of people who knew about the treasure. Some argued that dispersing the collection increased the risk of discovery or loss, but Robert argued persuasively that having everything in one location was itself a risk. Fire, flood, landslide, or discovery could destroy it all in one stroke. Better to distribute the materials, creating redundancy and increasing the chances that something would survive to the modern era. Over 20 years, Robert systematically moved documents. Some went to private collections, their true significance hidden among other manuscripts. Some were donated anonymously to university libraries, where they were catalogued as minor curiosities of uncertain provenance. The most sensitive materials, the stone tablets, the copper scroll, the alternative gospels, remained in the cave, but now they had companions scattered across Scotland, England, and even France. Robert also did something else revolutionary. He photographed the documents. Photography was still a new technology, but Robert recognized its potential. He created a photographic record of the collection, multiple copies hidden in bank vaults and with trusted associates. Now, even if the originals were lost, their contents would survive. The 20th century brought unprecedented changes. 2 world wars sent armies across Europe again. Governments became more intrusive and capable of surveillance, and nowhere remained truly remote. In 1942, fearing Nazi interest in occult artifacts and esoteric knowledge, the Guardian at that time moved the remaining items from the cave to a new location, a specially constructed vault beneath Manor House in the lowlands. This final move marked the end of the valley's role in the story. The cave was empty now, its secrets dispersed, its guardianship passed into history. But the tradition continued. There were still people who knew about the Templar treasure, who protected the journal and its copies, who ensured that the dispersed documents remained safe. In the late 20th century, scholars began publishing research on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, and other ancient texts that challenged traditional religious narratives. Some of these scholars, unknowingly, were working with documents that had come from the Templar collection, materials that had been hidden for 7 centuries before gradually making their way into academic circulation. The story might have ended there, another medieval mystery partially solved by modern scholarship. But in 2003, A historian named Dr. Sarah Chen made an unexpected discovery. While researching Templar history in Scotland, she found a reference in an old parish record to a hermit in the Highlands who had been buried with great ceremony in 1320. The description of the location matched no known monastic site, and the elaborate burial seemed odd for a simple hermit. Following this lead, Dr. Chen spent months searching, using modern mapping technology, satellite imagery, and hiking through remote valleys. She found the ruins of the old monastery, the remnants of stone huts, and finally, the cave. It was empty, of course, but on the walls, barely visible beneath centuries of grime and mineral deposits, she found carved symbols, crosses, geometric patterns, and marks that matched Templar iconography. She also found something else, a sealed ceramic jar hidden in a crack in the cave ceiling, placed so cleverly that it had been missed by all previous occupants. Inside was a letter written in Latin, dated 1862. It was from Robert Cameron, the guardian who had dispersed the collection. He had left this message for whoever finally discovered the cave, explaining in general terms what had been hidden there and why. If you read this, the letter said, it means the valley's secret has finally been revealed. Do not despair that you have not found gold or jewels. The true treasure of the Templars was never material wealth, but knowledge. Knowledge that challenges, enlightens, and transforms. Much of what we protected has now, through various means, found its way into the world. It lives in libraries, and universities, in the minds of scholars who study texts they do not realize were preserved by warrior monks 7 centuries ago. The guardianship has ended because it succeeded. The light that the Templars kindled has not been extinguished, but has spread beyond any cave or vault to illuminate the world. Dr. Chen published her findings in a carefully worded academic paper. She described finding the cave and the letter, discussed the historical evidence for a Templar presence in Scotland, and suggested that some materials from Templar archives might have survived and been integrated into later collections. She did not reveal everything the letter contained. Some secrets were still too sensitive, some connections too dangerous to make explicit. But she understood now the larger truth. The Knights Templar's hidden treasure had never been lost. It had been carefully, methodically, brilliantly preserved and dispersed over 7 centuries by a succession of dedicated guardians. Pieces of it lived in museums, libraries, private collections, and scholarly publications around the world. The knowledge that Guillaume and his companions had risked everything to protect had achieved exactly what they hoped. It had survived, it had spread, and it continued to challenge and enlighten those who encountered it. In her office at the university, Dr. Chen kept a photograph of the empty cave and a translation of Cameron's letter. Sometimes she wondered about the journal, the original chronicle that Guillaume had begun in 1307, and that had grown for centuries. Where was it now? Who held it? Was there still a guardian somewhere, maintaining the ancient trust? She suspected she would never know, and perhaps that was appropriate. Some mysteries deserved to remain mysteries, not because truth should be hidden, but because the search for truth was itself valuable. The Templars had understood this. They had been, above all else, seekers, seeking not just to protect what was known, but to preserve the possibility of knowing, to keep alive the human capacity for wonder, questioning, and discovery. The real treasure, Dr. Chen realized, was not objects but ideas. It was the understanding that truth was too important to be controlled by any single institution, that knowledge belonged to humanity rather than to kings or popes, and that the greatest service one could perform was to ensure that light, however small, continued to shine through the darkness of ignorance and oppression. 700 years after Guillaume closed the cave for the first time, his mission was complete. The treasure of the Knights Templar had been found because it had never truly been lost. It had simply been waiting, patient and enduring, for the world to be ready to receive it. The forest that moves on its own. In the highlands of what is now called Transylvania, there existed a forest that the locals refused to name. They called it only the woods that walk, or the trees with feet, and they marked its boundaries with stones painted red, warning travellers to go around, never through. This was in the year 1743, though the forest had been moving long before any calendar marked time in those mountains. Helena first heard of the forest from her grandmother, who heard it from her grandmother, who claimed to have seen it shift positions between the valley and the ridge over the course of a single lifetime. The old woman said the forest had once stood 3 miles to the east, covering the meadow where the village now kept its sheep. She said the trees moved slowly, so slowly that you could watch one for a year and never see it take a step, but that if you looked away and then looked back after many seasons, you would find it had travelled far. Helena was 24 years old when she decided to find the truth. She had spent her whole life in the village of Brasov, working in her father's workshop, binding books and copying manuscripts for the monastery. She had read everything the monks would allow her to read, and many things they would not, and in all those pages she had never found a single mention of a forest that could move. Yet everyone in her village spoke of it as fact, as certain as the sunrise, as real as the mountains themselves. On the morning of the 15th of March, 1743, Helena packed a leather satchel with bread, cheese, dried meat, a tinderbox, 2 candles, her journal, and 3 quills with a bottle of ink. She told her father she was visiting her aunt in the next valley, kissed her younger brother goodbye, and set out before dawn when the air was still sharp with winter's memory. The red stones marked the forest's current boundary along the old Roman road, about 2 miles north of the village. Helena had passed these stones 100 times in her life, but had never stepped beyond them. The superstition ran deep, enforced not by law, but by fear that had calcified over generations into something harder than any rule. She crossed the boundary at mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to cast short shadows. The moment she stepped past the red stones, she felt a change in the air. Not magical exactly, but different. The way the air feels different inside a church or a cave. The forest before her was dense with oak and beech, their trunks massive and ancient, their roots breaking through the earth in twisted coils that looked almost like fingers grasping at the soil. Helena walked for an hour, marking her path by breaking small branches at eye level, a trick her brother had taught her. The forest was quieter than she expected. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered in the branches. The only sound was her own footsteps on the carpet of old leaves and the whisper of wind through the canopy high above. She found the first sign 2 hours after entering. It was a root, thick as her thigh, that had broken the surface of the earth in a way that looked almost deliberate. The root stretched across her path like a serpent. and where it emerged from the ground, the soil was freshly disturbed, dark and moist, as if the tree had only just pushed it up through the earth. Elena knelt and touched the exposed root. It was warm, warmer than it should have been in the cool spring air. She wrote in her journal, "Root feels alive in a way that ordinary roots do not, as if blood moves through it instead of the sap." Elena continued deeper. The trees grew larger as she went, their trunks so wide that 5 men holding hands could not have circled them. The bark was strange, too, rougher than normal oak, with patterns that almost looked like faces if you stared long enough. Sad faces, angry faces, faces frozen in eternal surprise. She touched one of these patterns, tracing what might have been an eye, and the bark felt warm beneath her fingers, pulsing faintly with something that might have been a heartbeat, or might have been her imagination. At noon, she stopped to eat. She sat with her back against one of the massive trees and unwrapped her bread and cheese. As she ate, she watched the forest around her, looking for any sign of movement. The trees stood perfectly still, as trees should. Nothing walked, nothing shifted. She began to wonder if the stories were just stories after all, myths created to explain ordinary things. Perhaps the forest had simply grown over time, spreading naturally, and people had mistaken its slow expansion for deliberate movement. Then she heard the sound. It was deep, so deep she felt it in her chest before she heard it with her ears. A groaning, creaking sound, like the hull of a great ship straining against heavy seas. Elena stood quickly, scattering crumbs, her heart suddenly racing. The sound came again, and this time she could tell it came from all around her, from the trees themselves, as if they were speaking to each other in a language of wood and fibre. She backed away from the tree she had been leaning against and saw that the pattern in its bark, the face she had traced with her finger, had changed. The eye was now open wider, and the mouth, which before had been a neutral line, now curved downward in what might have been sorrow or warning. Elena ran. She ran back the way she had come, following her broken branches, her satchel bouncing against her hip. Groaning sound followed her, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes all around. She did not look back. She did not stop. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, ran until she burst through the tree line and stumbled past the red stones, collapsing on the safe side of the boundary. She lay in the grass, gasping, her face pressed against the earth. When she finally gathered the courage to look back, the forest stood exactly as it had before, silent and still, revealing nothing. But Elena had seen enough. She knew now that the stories were true. The forest was alive in a way that ordinary forests were not, and it was aware of her. She returned to the village and told no one what had happened. She went back to her father's workshop and resumed her work, binding books and copying manuscripts. But every day she thought about the forest. She read everything she could find about forests, about trees, about ancient magics and old gods. She read Roman histories that mentioned dark groves where druids practiced forbidden rites. She read Christian texts that spoke of demons dwelling in wild places. She read folk tales from 12 different lands, all telling variations of the same story. Trees that walked, forests that thought, woods that hungered. 3 months passed. Summer came, thick and warm, filling the valley with the scent of wildflowers and new grass. Elena continued her research, filling journal after journal with notes and theories. She became obsessed. barely sleeping, barely eating, until her father grew concerned and her brother began to worry that she had been cursed. On the 21st of June, the summer solstice, Elena returned to the forest. This time she came prepared. She brought rope, chalk, a knife, more food, and a small bronze mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. She also brought something else, a cutting from a willow tree, still green and living, which she had kept in water for the past week, encouraging it to grow roots. She crossed the red stones at dawn and entered the forest with her head high and her fear carefully controlled. She went deeper this time, past the place where she had eaten lunch on her first visit, past the tree with the changing face, deeper into the heart of the moving wood. The trees here were even larger, so tall that their tops disappeared into a canopy so thick that only scattered needles of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The trunks were covered in moss that glowed faintly green in the dim light, and mushrooms grew in rings around their bases, white mushrooms with red spots, the kind her grandmother had warned her never to touch. Lena found what she was looking for in a clearing, though calling it a clearing was not quite right. It was more like a space where the trees had chosen not to grow, a perfect circle about 30 feet across, carpeted with soft grass that seemed too green, too perfect to be natural. In the center of the circle stood a single stone, dark and smooth, carved with symbols that Elena did not recognize. She approached it slowly, her hand on the knife at her belt, though she knew a knife would be useless against whatever power dwelled here. She knelt before the stone and placed the willow cutting on its surface. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. I come seeking knowledge, not to harm or take. I offer this living gift in exchange for understanding. Why do you move? What do you seek? For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest remained silent. Elena waited, counting her breaths, forcing herself to stay calm. Then the stone began to warm beneath the willow cutting. The warmth spread, and the cutting's roots, which Elena had carefully encouraged to grow, began to lengthen and thicken before her eyes. They grew down into the stone, impossibly, as if the stone were soft earth, and the willow's leaves unfurled and reached upward toward the distant sky. The groaning sound came again, but softer this time, almost gentle, and Elena understood, not through words, but through feeling, through a knowledge that seemed to pour directly into her mind. The forest was answering her. The forest had been moving for thousands of years, since long before humans built their villages in these mountains. It moved because it was searching, slowly wandering across the land, seeking something it had lost in an age before memory. What it sought, the forest itself had forgotten. It knew only that it must continue searching, must keep moving, driven by an ancient purpose that had become instinct. The trees were not individual beings, but parts of a greater whole, like fingers on a hand or leaves on a branch. The forest itself was the creature, and it thought in seasons rather than moments, planned in decades rather than days. It moved by growing new roots ahead, while the old roots behind slowly died, a process so gradual that even the longest-lived human would see only the slightest shift. Elena understood all this in an instant, the way you understand a dream upon waking. The knowledge came with a cost, a terrible loneliness that made her gasp and press her hands to her chest. The forest was alone, utterly alone, the last of its kind. There had been others once, other forests that thought and moved, covering the world in green consciousness. But they had been burned, cut down, built over, destroyed by the small, quick creatures who had no patience for things that moved slowly and thought in centuries. This forest survived only because it had learned to hide, to seem ordinary, to move so slowly that humans dismissed the stories as superstition. But it was dying anyway, not from violence, but from loneliness, from the slow erosion of purpose. It had been searching for so long that it could no longer remember what it sought, and without purpose, even a forest mind begins to feed. Elena wept. She wept for the forest and for herself, for all the lonely things in the world that search for connection they can never find. Her tears fell on the stone and on the willow cutting that now grew from it, and the forest felt her grief and understood that she, too, was searching for something she could not name. The willow grew faster, its trunk thickening, its branches spreading. In the span of hours, it became a young tree, then a mature tree, its roots diving deep into the stone and through it into the earth beneath. The forest accepted this gift, this living bridge between Elena's world and its own, and through the willow it spoke more clearly. It showed her memories, visions that unfolded in her mind like stories. She saw the forest as it had been 10,000 years ago, stretching from one horizon to the other, connected to a dozen other forest minds across a world that was mostly wild. She saw how they had communicated through roots that touched beneath the earth, sharing thoughts across vast distances, thinking slow, deep thoughts about the nature of growth and decay, light and darkness, life and death. She saw the first humans arrive, small and quick and terrified, seeking shelter beneath the branches. The forests had not minded. There was room enough for everyone, and the humans were interesting, with their fast thoughts and their strange ability to change the world around them, with tools and fire. The forests had watched with curiosity as the humans built shelters, planted crops, domesticated animals, created societies. But the humans multiplied faster than the forests had anticipated. They cut trees for fuel and building, cleared land for farming, burned the woods to drive out predators. They did not understand that some forests were alive in a way that other forests were not, that some groves were individual minds that could feel pain and loss. Or perhaps they understood and did not care, driven by their own needs, their own desperate search for safety and prosperity. One by one, the forest minds died, cut down, burned, drowned beneath rising seas, paved over with stone roads and cities. They died calling out to each other through their root networks, their last thoughts shared across diminishing distances until only silence remained. This forest, the last one, had survived by retreating to the mountains, to places too steep and rocky for easy farming, too remote for cities. It moved constantly, following the wild spaces, staying ahead of the expanding human world. But the wild spaces were shrinking. Every year, the forest had fewer places to go. Every decade, it grew more difficult to hide. Lena saw all this and understood that she was witnessing the end of something ancient and irreplaceable. In 100 years, perhaps less, this forest would have nowhere left to move. It would be discovered, studied, cut down for timber, or cleared for farmland, or simply burned, because people fear what they cannot understand. Unless something changed. Elena opened her eyes, unaware that she had closed them. The sun had moved. Hours had passed while she communed with the forest mind. The willow tree was now fully grown, as tall as the surrounding oaks, its silver-green leaves rustling in a breeze Elena could not feel. Through its roots, she remained connected to the forest, could feel its thoughts like a second heartbeat alongside her own. She spoke aloud, forming the thought that had been growing in her mind. What if people knew, not as superstition, but as truth? What if they understood what you are, what you represent? Would they protect you, or would they fear you more? The forest's response was complex, layered with centuries of experience. Some humans might protect it, yes, but others would seek to destroy it precisely because they understood its power. And still others would want to study it, dissect it, understand how it worked, which would be a different kind of death. The forest had survived by remaining a myth, a story told to frighten children and amuse travelers. To be revealed would be to be destroyed. Elena sat back on her heels, thinking. She was a scholar, trained to preserve knowledge, to copy texts and maintain records. Every instinct told her to document what she had discovered, to write down everything the forest had shown her, to share this incredible finding with the world. But she was also human enough to understand what that would mean. The scholars would come, then the curious, then the fearful, then the soldiers with their axes and torches. Then, I will keep your secret, she said finally. But I will visit you if you allow it. I will walk with you as you move through the mountains. I will be your witness, even if I can never tell anyone what I have witnessed. The forest considered this. Elena felt its deliberation, slow and careful as roots seeking water through stone. Finally, it agreed. More than agreed. It welcomed her. In all the long centuries of its existence, it had never had a companion who truly understood what it was. The loneliness had been growing unbearable. Even if Elena could only stay for brief moments of her brief life, even if she would die in what was, to the forest, barely an eye blink of time, still it was grateful for the connection. They made a pact that day, Elena and the forest. She would come once every new moon, would sit in the clearing with the willow tree, would share her thoughts and receive the forest's slow wisdom in return. She would keep its secret, would mark its boundaries with the red stones, would ensure that the villagers continued to fear and avoid it. In exchange, the forest would share its memories, would teach her things that no book could contain, would show her a perspective on time and existence that no human had ever known. For 37 years, Elena kept that pact. She never married, never left the valley, never spoke of what she knew. She continued to work in her father's workshop, and after he died, she ran it herself, becoming known as the finest bookbinder in the region. She trained her brother's children in the craft, teaching them to respect knowledge and guard secrets, though she never told them the greatest secret of all. Every month, on the night of the new moon, she would tell her apprentices she needed to gather herbs in the mountains, and she would walk to wherever the forest had moved itself. Sometimes she had to walk for miles, following the slowly shifting boundary marked by the red stones that she quietly moved to match the forest's migration. Sometimes the forest had barely traveled at all, its roots settling in a location for years before moving on. She watched the forest shift northward, always northward, over the decades. She calculated that it moved approximately 1 mile every 7 years, though the pace was not constant. Some years it moved quickly, as much as half a mile. Other years it barely moved at all, its roots holding firm as if it had found a place it particularly liked. Through the willow tree, the forest told her its thoughts. It spoke of the changing seasons with an intimacy that only something that had witnessed 10,000 springs could know. It told her how the winter of 1752 had been the coldest in 300 years, how the summer of 1768 had been so wet that mushrooms grew thick as carpets on its floor. It spoke of the animals that sheltered in its shade, the wolves that denned among its roots, the owls that nested in its highest branches, the deer that came to browse on the saplings at its edges. Elena, in turn, told the forest about the human world. She told it about the books she bound, the stories they contained, the ideas that humans created and shared through writing. She explained wars and religions, art and science, love and loss. The forest listened with fascination to these tales of the quick, bright creatures who lived such intense, brief lives. In 1779, when Elena was 60 years old, she noticed that the forest had stopped moving. For 3 years, it remained in the same location, its roots settled deep into a valley between two peaks. She asked it why, and it showed her. Beneath this valley ran the aquifer, a river of pure water flowing through limestone caves, and the water tasted of minerals and thyme. The forest was drinking deeply, storing strength for the journey ahead. In 1780, the soldiers came. They were Austrian troops marching through the mountains on their way to some distant conflict Elena did not understand. They made camp in the valley below the forest, and their officers, seeing the dense woods, ordered their men to cut timber for fires and fortifications. The soldiers took their axes and approached the red stones. Elena, in her workshop 3 miles away, felt a cold dread settle over her heart. She could not say how she knew, but she knew. The forest was in danger. She left her work unfinished, ignored her apprentice's questions, and ran. Actually ran, though she was 60 years old and had not run in years. Up the mountain path toward the forest. She arrived to find the soldiers already cutting. They'd crossed the boundary marked by the red stones, dismissed the local warnings as superstition, and begun felling the outer trees. Elena watched in horror as a massive oak, one she had touched 100 times, crashed to the earth with a groan that sounded exactly like a scream. She felt the forest's pain through the connection they shared, a sharp agony that made her stumble and fall to her knees. The soldiers were not just cutting trees, they were cutting flesh, severing nerves, causing wounds that would take decades to heal if they healed at all. Elena stood and ran toward the soldiers, shouting at them to stop, but they laughed at the old women and pushed her aside. Their captain, a young man with cold eyes, told her that the empire needed timber more than it needed old-growth forest. She should go home before she got hurt. She refused to leave. She stood between the soldiers and the next tree they had marked for cutting, spreading her arms, daring them to strike her down along with the oak. The captain ordered her removed, and 2 soldiers grabbed her arms and began to drag her away. That was when the forest began to move, not slowly as it had moved for all the centuries of its existence. This time it moved quickly, desperately, like an animal fleeing fire. The roots beneath the earth twisted and writhed. The trees groaned and creaked. The ground itself began to shift and buckle as the forest pulled up its anchoring roots and began to run.